As someone with responsibility for Australia's security and our borders, was a pandemic something you had planned for or expected?
We certainly did a lot of work, particularly with the formation of Home Affairs in the latter part of 2017, to start looking at some of the stress tests that we would need to apply, and pandemic was certainly one of the early ones that we looked at in the period January, February and March of 2018. That's certainly the case.
And then was the prospect of shutting the borders kind of looked at? Was that something that you ever said, look, we may get in the situation, we just have to do that?
That's always one of the early components in your playbook is early border intervention. Whether you shut completely or whether you shut from the hotspot area is obviously something that you need to contemplate at the time, but it's certainly in the playbook. Absolutely.
Well, when did it become apparent to you that you had to advise government that the borders needed to shut? And I'm not talking about shutting them to China necessarily. I mean just generally. When did that become apparent to you, given it was in the playbook?
Well, Andrew, I guess that goes, if I can just make a very brief comment on the role of departments and agencies in this circumstance. Obviously, it's ministers who make decisions, and I just want to stress to you and your viewers that we're here as advisors, whether it's Brendan Murphy. You've seen a lot of Brendan, formerly the Chief Medical Officer, now the Secretary, my fellow colleague on the Secretary's Board for Health. I'm the Secretary of Home Affairs. It becomes apparent to us early when the information starts to become clear that we have to advise government, and obviously it's ministers who make decisions. So I just want to make that clear. Obviously, it's something that you will understand, and most of your viewers would, but it's really important that everyone understands that it's ministers who make decisions. We are public officials, but we're unelected, and in the end, in a democracy, it's ministers who are the key decision makers. As Professor Murphy's made clear, he put out some advisories as the Chief Medical Officer in the second half of January. Obviously, we're also contending at the time with bushfires, and the public health officials all around the country who form the Australian Health Protection Principal Committee started to look at this question seriously in the latter part of January, as Brendan has said in other proceedings.
So you looked at closure of borders generally right from the end of January. You were already looking at that.
The decision about the first border closure was announced on the 1st of February. So obviously, in the lead up to that was late January. Those discussions were going on, as Professor Murphy's made clear, in the latter part of January.
In terms of the origins of this pandemic, there's this theory espoused out of the US that it could have originated in a lab. Is there any chance that's the case, or any evidence that's the case?
And our best advice to government has been, as the Prime Minister, the Health Minister, the Foreign Minister and others have said, is that it's most likely that this pandemic has a natural origin, but it's incredibly important, even if there's a minuscule chance of there being some other cause, or indeed the nature of the natural transmission, it's incredibly important that the international community of nations comes together to look at this question, and that's why the Australian government was so resolute in pressing for the independent UN inquiry through the auspices of the World Health Organization.
How long are you preparing yourself as the border chief in the bureaucracy for our international borders to be shut? Are you sort of planning and saying, look, we could have this for 5 years, international borders shut except for this hotel quarantining? What should we expect as citizens, according to the best advice you can give?
Very, very quickly come to your question, but I just want to take this opportunity as a Secretary of a department. I just want to thank my own staff as well as other public servants. Our first responders do a magnificent job, and they should be lauded for what they do. The AMBOs, the fireys, and in this case, obviously, our doctors, our nurses, those in pathology, and other people involved in the public health response. But in the back rooms, I just really very quickly want to thank all of our staff, whether you're in an ops centre, whether you're in working on supermarkets, whether you're working on supply chain issues, whether you're working with our colleagues in the Attorney General's Department on the industrial relations issues. It's been a fantastic team effort of everyone pulling together. I want to really laud the first responders, absolutely, and you see them in the public all the time, but also want to thank the public servants who are doing such a sterling job in the back offices. In terms of timing, well, that's the big question, Andrew. As has been stated by the Health Minister, the health professionals, the Chief Medical Officer and their colleagues, the chief health officers. It's really a function of two things. When will a vaccine be available on a mass scale and or a treatment that at least can ameliorate the effects of the virus? Until the answer to that question is known, we can't really answer the question that you've asked, Andrew, and I'm not seeking to shy away from that. And obviously we have to plan for all contingencies. And the contingencies could involve a relaxation of controls over time and then their reimposition depending on circumstances, and you're obviously seeing that having to be applied in Victoria. And you've seen it in a country which achieved virtual elimination in the case of New Zealand. You've seen the Prime Minister there and her government having to reimpose controls, albeit in a defined locality of Auckland. So we have to be prepared for all eventualities.
All right. Well, what about this speculation we've had? International students could be allowed back, or I suppose sort of limited streams of migration, carefully monitored hotel quarantine. Is there any prospect of that next year, or are we likely to be where we're at now? I guess it's a question of risk, isn't it? How much risk the government wants to take, the country wants to take.
It's certainly a question of risk, and consistent with the theme of this interview, it'll be for ministers in the end to make those decisions. They face incredible burdens which people like me get to see firsthand. We get to attend the Cabinet Committee meetings. We see the complexity of the risk factors that they have to take into account. The Prime Minister, his senior colleagues within the Australian Cabinet, the Premiers, the Chief Ministers, the Chief Health Officers who have got a critical role. It really is a team effort, and in a democracy, of course, it's ministers who have to make the final call. Certainly in terms of advising them, which is the role that I play, and I don't advise on clinical matters, but I advise on the logistics and other matters that I mentioned earlier. It is going to have to be a balance of risk. As the Prime Minister has said, we're fighting on two fronts here, if I can use that military-like analogy. We're fighting a health crisis and we're fighting an economic crisis. And you've got to get the calibration right, because if you overdo a response in one respect, you unintendedly tank your economy or destroy your economy. And equally, if you have too much regard for other factors, you potentially exacerbate the public health risk. As has been indicated, and certainly prior to the wave that's coming through in Victoria, the government was looking at the opportunity to engage in initiatives such as trans-Tasman travel, limited arrival of international students under COVID-safe arrangements. All of those options are constantly being looked at, and the job of public servants in departments and agencies is to keep all of those options alive, to keep working on them, and constantly to be providing ministers with the evidence, the options and the advice that they need so that they can do their job, which is to make the final decisions.
Well, migration's been such an important part of our economy for so long, hasn't it? The Treasury likes it. It helps the budget. It helps the economy. How much will it hurt our economy then if we have 3 to 4 years of no migration or very limited migration?
Well, Andrew, I just think it's too speculative to build upon a premise like that, a question like that. When you say 3 to 4 years, that is very speculative. I respect and understand why you'd ask that. We have to take this carefully in phases. We have to deal with what's in front of us. Of course, the Treasury is looking at different scenarios. The Secretary-Treasury has given public evidence about the different factors that he, the Reserve Bank Governor, look at again in terms of providing the Treasurer with advice. In the case of the Governor, of course, the decisions he leads as the head of the RBA board. I think it's too speculative and too loose, though, to be assuming nil migration for 3, 4 or 5 years, but equally I can't give you any kind of estimate as to when the net overseas migration numbers that we've seen in recent years will be able to be achieved.
How are your staff assisting in Victoria, and where do you see the challenges down there in aged care in particular?
In Victoria, we've provided assistance across a range of fronts, including through the NCM meetings that I just mentioned. We've had terrific collaboration with the Premier's Department, with the Department of Jobs and various other instrumentalities within the Victorian system. We've been assisting Commissioner Crisp as the Emergency Management Controller across a range of those logistics, supermarket, distribution, freight issues that I mentioned earlier, and obviously collaborating with our federal colleagues who have got the deep expertise As the Prime Minister announced some weeks ago, we've also put a command element, a coordination element from our emergency management team. We've dropped that into the Victorian Aged Care Response Centre, and that's currently being coordinated by an emergency management controller who's working with the state and Commonwealth clinicians who are the experts in the actual delivery of care, and that's been designed to assist both the operators of those residences but also the public health officials to ensure that the best care can be distributed. We don't make the clinical calls, I have to say. You ask about what my staff are doing. We do not make any clinical calls, but we help with the logistics, the rostering, ensuring that the AUSMAT teams are getting to where they need to get to, ensuring that the acute cases are triaged and that we support the clinical decisions, including moving people into hospitals, with all the logistics and the operational coordination that goes into a multi-agency effort. These are public health matters, of course, but the clinicians I know value the assistance of logisticians, comms experts, coordinators, people who can run command posts, and they certainly value that assistance. I know that very, very directly.
Do you have a view on why hotel quarantine was such a disaster down there and why it seems to have worked pretty seamlessly elsewhere?
Andrew, I don't have a direct view on that. Obviously, my role as a public official is to make sure that my officers have conducted themselves appropriately. We weren't obviously involved in the Victorian program. I know that there's a Victorian inquiry that you're well covering with your colleague Kieran Gilbert. There's also, of course, a national cabinet mandated review of hotel quarantine matters undertaken by my colleague, former Commonwealth Secretary Jane Holton. I'll await those inquiries. The Prime Minister said just the other day in a social media message, where there have been shortcomings, they'll be acknowledged and dealt with.
Let me touch just briefly on the Ruby Princess. Is there anything different the ABF could have done here, or your officials could have done? Could the federal officials have performed better in terms of this, as well as the state officials in New South Wales?
Well, Andrew, thanks for asking me. And as we record this interview, of course, we await the bringing down of Mr Walker's inquiry, which I understand to be later today. Commissioner Outram's given evidence on this question to the Senate. The Commonwealth obviously separately and voluntarily submitted extensive materials to Mr Walker. I don't want to second guess or to provide commentary on either the Commissioner's evidence and advice, nor that of my colleague, the Agriculture Secretary. Suffice to say that it's very clear on both everything that I've seen, everything that I've read and everything that I've heard, as the Commissioner has said, as Secretary Metcalfe has said, as Home Affairs Minister Dutton has said, that the biosecurity delegations clearly properly fall to the public health experts that in a federation properly sit in states and territories. I don't say that, Andrew, for any reason other than they're the people best equipped to make the risk judgment about whether isolation needs to occur, whether aggressive contact tracing needs to occur, whether quarantine needs to occur. And I'll just reflect in this way to answer your question, Andrew. Imagine a circumstance where federal officials had the absolute power under the biosecurity legislation to give public health clearance so that people, whether they're coming off cruise ships or whether they're coming off container ships as crew or whether they're coming off arriving planes, are cleared for entry into Australia, as we have powers to do for customs and immigration purposes. But then state chief health officers quite properly exercise their public health powers to deny entry to a state. Well, you'd have chaos at the terminal on the curb when people who'd been cleared for entry by federal officials were then being denied entry by state officials. So we have to work as a team. We have to work in a federated system, inevitably in public health terms, as a federated team where everyone plays their role and their part. We await Mr Walker's inquiry. We also await any deliberations and conclusions that the Senate Select Committee might come to, and will respond in kind. But I do provide that contextual frame, Andrew, for you and your viewers to think about, that in a situation where public health is a federated responsibility across the nation, we have to have a way in which state public health officials can make those risk judgments, because they're the ones in the end who are then going to have to make further decisions about contact tracing, follow-up testing, isolation and quarantine.
And you can see part 2 of that exclusive interview with the Home Affairs boss, Mike Pezzullo, tomorrow afternoon on Afternoon Agenda at 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time.